Hey folks, good to be with you tonight. A little bit different format than what we are accustomed to on Wednesday nights, or at least what we've been doing the last few months on Wednesday nights as we've met in the sanctuary and still done Facebook Live. But for just the next couple of weeks, 2 or 3 weeks, just taking a break from that. I really enjoyed the Bible studies from the office and just talking with you. And I know those were Facebook Live too. But just for a couple of weeks, I just want to post Wednesday night videos that you can access and watch. And because of that, if you're tuning in, we won't see your name. I won't be able to see your name pop up and show that you've joined us like we would in a Facebook Live video. So just give me a comment, give me a like, say hello, comment on the study tonight, offer your prayer request. Just interact somehow in that video, just so that we can see who all's joined us and who all is tuning in for the Wednesday night Bible study. Also, let me just encourage you to share. You've got family and friends who maybe aren't following the church's page. Share this video and just give an opportunity to tune in and to kind of see what we do on Wednesday nights in our Bible study. And again, we'll get back to the sanctuary in a couple weeks with the Facebook Live setting. But just for a week or two, as we finish up the book of Esther, we just want to do something a little bit different. Like I said, for those months that I came to you on Wednesday nights from the office, really loved it. It kind of gave me the atmosphere and the feeling of, even though nobody's in the room with me, nobody was in the room then, just kind of gives me the atmosphere of just family and a low-key, in a very casual setting. So just do it a little different for the next couple of weeks, and then we'll get back to our regular Wednesday night sanctuary Bible study with the Facebook Live as well. We're gonna look at Esther chapter 7 tonight. And then 8 and 9 next week. I had mentioned last week we might move on and finish out the whole book, but we'll go 2 more weeks, tonight and next week. And tonight is just chapter 7. It's a short chapter, but there's a lot to unpack in Esther chapter 7. So we'll take these 10 verses tonight and unpack them and study them. And then next week, 8 and 9 kind of go together anyway. So it's a lot of material in 8 and 9, but a lot of it can just be condensed, and we can finish up this really incredible study of the book of Esther and the story of Esther and Mordecai and all the Jews really next week when we look at 8 and 9. So tonight, let's just look at Esther chapter 7. And then when we get to the end tonight, we'll take a moment to pray over the needs that we may have. So we'll move to our intercessory prayer to the end. But tonight, for just a moment, let me ask the Lord to bless the next few minutes that we spend together studying the Word. Lord, we thank you for your Word. We ask, God, that you just bless it. Don't need flowery words. Don't need a long prayer. Lord, just the next few minutes we spend with you, may you use this time to draw us closer to you. And even as we watch on video, closer to each other. And may you be honored and glorified in all we do and say, including this time we spend studying your word. Open up our hearts and ears to hear from you. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay, so quick review of chapters 5 and 6 of Esther, and then we'll jump into 7 tonight. Remember, Esther had taken a serious risk entering the king's court, uninvited, unannounced. It could have meant her death if the king had been displeased with her breaking from protocol and entering into his court without his invitation. Instead, the king receives her, honors her, and tells her, what do you want, baby? Anything you want, anything up to half the kingdom is yours. So we see just, I'm certain, a beautiful woman, but an influential woman, and one that even though he hadn't seen her in 30 days or more by now, it's a woman that maybe had the king at least somewhat wrapped around her finger, or at least had such an appreciation from the king and a love from the king that upon seeing her, then he's ready to do whatever she wants him to do. So she invited him and Haman to a banquet later that day, which is kind of unusual. You would think that she would just have come, here's what I need. Maybe her desire was to get him alone and to present this request and to come clean with the fact that she was a Jew and that Haman's edict was a danger to her and her family as well. But she invites him and Haman. Last week I mentioned that it's very, courageous of her to not only invite the king, but also to invite her accuser. And I think that there's a spiritual a spiritual law that we can apply there, where, you know what, if sometimes it's necessary to just be a little bold and to stand up to your accusers. And so I'm going to give Esther kudos here, even though it seems maybe she's stalling a little bit. Maybe she's not quite sure what the next step to take is. At the same time, her faith is growing and her courage is growing to invite Haman to this banquet, the very one who wants to kill her husband, or her uncle Mordecai, really her father Mordecai, her adopted father, and all the Jews. She wants to confront him personally. So kudos to Esther in that. So she's invited them to this banquet. Now that banquet, the king again says, "What do you want, wife, queen? Anything you want, baby, it's all yours." And she invites him to another banquet the next day. So there does seem to be, and I say this without criticism, there does seem to be some waffling. There does seem to be some uncertainty. We don't really know. We're speculating. But for whatever reason, whatever Esther's motivation and reason for delaying and asking the two of these men, the king and his most trusted advisor, Haman, to come back the next day, for whatever the reason, God has a purpose and reason in doing that. And it's during that night where we read the verses of Esther chapter 6, verse 1. This is the night in between the two banquets. That night the king could not sleep. So one was commanded to bring the book of the records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. I've said this every time I say the word Chronicles. That doesn't mean the book of Chronicles as we have in the Bible, but that is the king's history books, if you will. And see what had just happened after this banquet, the first banquet. Haman comes out of that banquet very encouraged and full of vigor, because he has been with the king and the queen, and he's kind of full of himself here, and he's like, you know what, I'm ready just to kill Mordecai, because he walks out of that banquet with the king and the queen, the first banquet, and he sees Mordecai, and Mordecai still isn't honoring him. Mordecai still isn't bowing down to him. And so Haman's like, you know what, I'm not going to wait till November or whatever, the end of the year. Remember, it was the end of the year where they were going to have this killing spree of all the Jews. I just say November. Of course, they didn't go by our calendar, but the end of the year. And so Haman's like, you know what? I'm not going to wait till the end of the year. I'm ready to kill this guy right now. And so his plan was the next day, the next morning, before this wonderful second banquet with the king and queen, he was going to go see the king and say, hey, can I kill Mordecai? Can I just kill him? And so he makes gallows ready. And I mentioned this a few weeks ago, but it might not have been gallows in the sense of hanging a man. It might have just been a big, tall spear or pole where they would literally impale, if that's the right, impale. I'm looking around like there's somebody to ask in here. I think it's impale. Just cram somebody down on the pole. I mean, it's pretty gruesome. Either way, he makes a gallows or a killing stick of some sort, where he can hang Mordecai the next day when the king tells him he can do so. But as I mentioned, that night after the first banquet, and that night after Haman puts together a plan to request Mordecai's death, that night the king has this dream. And I mentioned way back weeks ago when we started this study that is 6:1. Esther 6:1 is the turning point in the story. Esther 6:1 is actually the most important, well, I say it's the focal point. Let me say that it's the focal point of the entire book. If you remember back weeks ago, I had the board up in the sanctuary actually, and there was A, B, C, B, A. And when you're using that chiastic structure in Hebrew Jewish writings, if it's A, B, C, and then a repeat of B, and then a repeat of A, then what these outside points are doing, A, B, are pointing to the middle, C, and that is the the focal. I wouldn't say the most important, because the most important verse in the entire story might be 4:14, probably so, where Mordecai doesn't mention the Lord at all, but he does say, Esther, maybe you're here for such a time as this. So we recognize that verse is probably the most important verse in this story. But 6:1 is the focal point and the turning point of the story, and it's where he has a sleepless night, the king does. And we would say that it's the providence of God, and it's the act of God that's keeping him awake. They bring the history books in, and he reads there and finds out that Mordecai, who had saved his life 5 years earlier, Mordecai had saved his life by exposing an attempt an assassination attempt on the king, and he had never been honored and never been rewarded. Mordecai hadn't for that. So the king then wants to honor Mordecai, rightfully so, and reward him for his act of bravery and his exposing the assassination attempt. Well, guess what? Haman is sitting outside waiting for the king to invite him in so that he can ask for Mordecai's life. And the king says, well, hey, what can we do for it? What can I do for a man I want to honor? Well, Haman, the narcissist that he is, the egotistic personality that he has, he thinks the king wants to honor him. And he's like, look, give the man one of your old robes, let the man ride one of your horses, and then let the king let the man be pranced about through town to be honored and recognized by all. And the king says, good idea, Haman. You go do that for Mordecai. How inflating that must have been for Haman. The one he hated. The one he wanted to kill. The one he was going to ask for permission from the king to hang that very day. And instead the king's going to honor him. This is so juicy. This is better than any movie you can watch, any novel you can read. The turn of events here, the turn of fortune that we see starting, it all begins there in Esther 6:1, and really from here to the end of chapter 7, it is just downhill for Haman. With that being said, let's get to chapter 7. Let's begin reading in verse 1. We'll read to verse 4, and then we'll discuss. So the king and Haman went to dine with Queen Esther. And this is after Haman's had to do what he was supposed to do in honoring Mordecai. Haman goes home. I should have mentioned this. Haman goes home, tells his wife, tells his friends, and they all recognize this as a bad omen. Oh my goodness, Haman, this is not good for you. The very man you wanted to kill is the man the king has honored. And they would say the gods are not in your favor anymore. Now we would look at the one true only living God, Jehovah, but they would like, this is a bad omen for you, and it was in that sense. Look at verse 1 of chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to dine with Esther. And on the second day of the banquet of wine, the king again said to Esther, this would have been at the end of the meal, what is your petition, Queen Esther? It shall be granted to you, and what is your request? Up to half the kingdom it shall be done. Basically what he said the day before. Then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found, I got my Bible right in front of me, but I'm reading from the computer just because the words are bigger. And even with these glasses, my age is catching up, and I can't even hardly read this small print. Then Queen Esther answered and said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and my people at my request. Okay, she's starting to come clean about who she is as a Jew. For if we have been sold, my people and I, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. This says, for we have been, I may have misread, for we have been sold, to be destroyed, to be killed, and be annihilated. Had we been sold as male and female slaves, I would have held my tongue, although the enemy would never compensate for the king's loss. Now, the need for this second banquet needs to be discussed. We've already alluded to it today in this study and talked about it extensively last week. Esther seems to be unsure of herself, or not quite ready. She didn't seem to be quite ready at the first banquet to come clean. Now, I'm just speculating there. We don't really know what her motivation was. Certainly, we've already talked about God's intention and how he wanted some things to play out in this story before she comes clean. Namely, he wanted to get Haman in a position where he was as confident as possible. And he even builds these gallows for Mordecai. A little foreshadowing there. I won't get to it yet. But so she's having to, we think, or at least can assume, she's having to gain some courage here. But what I do like, again, and I mentioned this already, but it bears repeating, I do like the fact that she seems to be gaining courage. Well, no, she's not just saying, she has gained courage, or at least whatever it took within her to present her need to the king. Whereas the day before, and really her whole life, and certainly her whole experience as queen, she has kept secret who she is. But here, she finally comes clean. She finally tells the king who she is. There seems to be a spiritual growth and strengthening in Esther throughout this story. I've been critical of Esther while we've been doing this study, and Mordecai. Well, Esther more, because she has been so secretive about who she was. And if she's secretive about being a Jew, then that means she's not practicing her religion, which means she's at least relaxing some of the regulations, the type of regulations that Daniel did not relax. She's certainly probably eating food she shouldn't be eating. She's probably not honoring the Sabbath. She's probably not praying to God as she should. I mean, these were things that the Jews had to do, the kind of things that got Daniel and the 3 Hebrew boys in trouble just a few decades before under the rule of the Babylonians. Now they're under the rule of the Medes and Persians, but the same principles in place. If you're a Jew and you're a practicing Jew, then there are just some things that you were not supposed to do. And certainly she is probably engaging in activity that we would not consider sinful necessarily, but for a Jew to break their traditions and to not honor the law, it's not just tradition, it's the law that God had given to them. She can't be a good Jew. And then live a secretive life, even as the queen of the empire. But at least I've been critical of her, but I'm going to praise Esther tonight. I mean, this is the growth that she shows, the standing up for her own life and for her people. She gets right to the point, sort of. She makes her request known immediately, but doesn't really offer a lot of details just yet. She honors the king. She humbles herself before the king, and then she makes this statement. In other words, she says, "I wouldn't mind being a slave, and my people don't mind being slaves. Hey, we've done it before. We were slaves for 400 years." She says, "We can be slaves, but it's not just about serving and servitude to another. Our lives are at stake here, and the lives of my people are at stake. So I've got to come clean, and I've got to present the need to the king." She uses the same words. I want to make mention of this before we move on to verse 5. She uses the same words here that Haman had used in chapter 3, verse 13 with his edict. And there in 3:13, he says, we're going to destroy, kill, and annihilate these Jews. And here she uses the same 3 words. She says, we are going to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. She's pretty specific here. Sometimes I think you got to get specific. Sometimes I think it's important for us as Christians in dealing with the enemy and even in dealing with God. We got to get specific. I think too many times as Christians we beat around the bush. We're vague. And sometimes our vagueness then leads to dishonesty. I think we've got to be careful there. When you want to dance around an issue, when you don't want to tackle something head on, certainly there's argument for being tactful, being loving, being careful. I know all that is true, and certainly it is required as us as loving brothers and sisters in Christ. At the same time, sometimes you just got to say, hey, 1, 2, 3, 4. Let's get specific and let's deal with these issues. And that's what Esther does here. And I just applaud her. I just applaud her for her actions here. And she's confronting not only the king, but she's confronting Haman. Here's your words, Haman. You want to destroy, kill, and annihilate us. Well, guess what? I'm here to defend myself and to defend my people. Look at verse 5. So King Ahasuerus, or King Xerxes, answered and said to Queen Esther, because he doesn't really know what she's talking about. Who is he? Where is he? Who would dare presume in his heart to do such a thing? Verse 6. Esther responds, the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. Man, this woman ain't no joke. Again, seems to be timid, seems to be unsure. That's all gone. She's filled here with a holy boldness, a righteous indignation, and anger even, and says the adversary and enemy is this wicked Haman. So Haman was terrified before the king and queen. Then the king arose in his wrath from the banquet of wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stood before Queen Esther, pleading for his life, for he saw that evil was determined against him by the king. The king didn't know Esther was a Jew. I don't even know that the king even knew what this edict was that she's referring to. Remember, Haman is the one who wrote the edict. He's the one who signed the edict with the king's signet ring. The king may have been oblivious to what was going on. You're talking about a vast, great empire here. I'm certain he doesn't know all that's happening. I mean, the same can be, you could talk about the president, and the president is not aware of everything that's going on in the country and in the government. And you can apply that all the way down to just a family. A family, the head of the family, the father, the mother, whoever it might be, is not going to be fully aware of all that's going on within the family that's around them. So, I don't know if we should... you would think something this important, though, that it's the Jews that are going to be killed. Of course, Haman had already been to approach the king about this, so he remembered that there was an edict that he was supposed to put out, or that Haman was going to do that. But the king's just piecing this together. He's finding out after the fact of all this going on here, especially the fact that Esther is the Jew and he doesn't know it. What's for sure, though, is that Haman didn't know Esther was a Jew. If Haman had known it, he wouldn't have been all that excited about dining with the king and the queen as he was. The king gets up and leaves the table. This was a sign in that day and age with the Persians. They had a custom of getting up and leaving, royal displeasure and anger. The same is true today. If we get up and leave a table in a meeting, or that's usually a sign of anger. I mean, you're angry about something. Look at verse 8. When the king returned from the palace. Oh, let me reiterate what happens here in verse 7, though. Back to verse 7. Haman stood before the queen, pleading for his life. Well, what a turn of events. The tables have turned, it seemed, even as they are at the table eating. The tables have turned, and now he's pleading for his life. Look at verse 8. When the king returned from the palace garden to the place of the banquet of wine, Haman had fallen across the couch where Esther was. I mean, Haman is begging for his life, and all sense of dignity and proper protocol is gone. He is begging for his life here. And he walks in, that is, the king walks in and sees Haman, who has fallen across the couch. Remember that they were probably eating, sitting down on the floor. That's what they did in the New Testament with Jesus there, and the first century Jew. Chances are that was the same kind of environment, reclining. A small table would have been set up where they could reach easily. So probably Esther is still reclining, and he has fallen over the couch, the table. He is groveling. Haman is begging for his life. The king comes in, and maybe in a rhetorical way or facetious way, the king says, will he also assault the queen while I am in the house? He desires for all the Jews to be killed. The king is piecing this together, and he walks in and he sees Haman, who is in a physical posture that is not proper. He's laying all over the couch where the queen is, and possibly getting physical, not necessarily physical in the sense of attacking her, and not necessarily getting physical in some sexual way. He is groveling. He is afraid for his life. And the king walks in and just sees him all over the queen. Is he going to kill her here while I'm in my house? As the word left the king's mouth, they, that is servants, because servants had come in, assumedly, upon the king's decree. Servants come in, they cover Haman's face and remove him. Harbona, one of the eunuchs, he's mentioned back in chapter 1, he says to the king, look, the gallows 50 cubits high, which Haman made for Mordecai, who spoke good on the king's behalf, is standing at the house of Haman. The king says, hang him on it. Still, this is so just dripping with irony and certainly with proper retribution here. Verse 10, so they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's wrath subsided. We see the character of all three of these individuals in this chapter. Haman, a prideful man, but really a man with a cowardly heart. The king is easily influenced, and at times it would appear he's weak, though certainly his actions here, his brash actions, I don't think you can call him rash necessarily, but his bold action here is probably warranted. This is the man who wants to kill his queen, though Haman didn't even know he wanted to kill the queen because he didn't know she was a Jew. But when you threw Mordecai into the story, and when the king finds out that Haman has built gallows so that he could kill Mordecai, the very man that the king just honored the day before, well, the king says, okay, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Take him. Go hang him on those gallows. And they do so. So the king's easily influenced and at times rash, but this action is warranted, and his tendency to do things quickly and to be easily influenced by others is actually to the advantage of the story in this instance, because the servant is able to influence him greatly, and they kill Haman. More irony, Haman, who was longing for Mordecai to bow down to him, now is groveling at the feet of Mordecai's daughter, unknowingly, but still. He is there begging for his life at Esther's feet, where just weeks and months earlier in the story, and even the day before, Mordecai refused to bow down to Haman, and it angered Haman so much that he not only devised this scheme to kill all the Jews, but he couldn't wait. He was ready to hang Mordecai that very day. Now, the precise purpose of the face covering is unknown. I mean, we could dig deep into some of these issues and what's really going on here, but I want to just offer a few contrasts in the story that I think are of interest. And maybe we've already touched on it, but here's some. Esther and Mordecai fasted. They prayed. We talked about that last week, that praying is not mentioned. We talked about that last couple weeks, actually. That praying is not mentioned, but certainly in the fasting, you have an element of prayer there. But what's interesting is that you see Mordecai, Esther, and those Jews that were close to them fasting for 3 days in preparation for this event. And this event is a banquet where they're eating and drinking. Again, Esther and Mordecai fasting, praying, certainly seeking God for direction and for favor. And the enemy is eating and drinking. It's the same thing that happened earlier on in chapter 3, where the king and Haman sit down and celebrate and have a meal while the city is bewildered, uncertain of what's going on. I think that's interesting comparison there of what's going on. God's people are fasting. God's people are praying. God's people are denying themselves physical pleasure, that is food, in an effort to seek the will of God. And the enemy is just partying. The enemy is eating and drinking and having a good time. And I think that, let me make this point. I know we sometimes are somewhat fearful of the enemy, Satan, and his minions, and even in a physical sense, those who come against us. But let's understand that the enemy ain't really that smart. He is like a lion seeking whom he may devour. But we're told to be wise as serpents, harmless as doves. The point being that in spite of how sneaky and conniving the enemy may seem, God is smarter. And all we've got to do is instead, and the enemy will get overly confident, which is what happens here. Haman thinks he's going to walk in and ask for Mordecai's life, hanging him by his neck. And while he is overconfidently thinking that's going to happen, God is at work. And while the enemy's partying and drinking and carousing and carrying on and having a good time because they seem to have won the day, no, God wins the war. And so even if let me just preach this point for you right now tonight. Even if you're in the middle of what seems like, let me take my glasses off for effect. Even if you're in the middle of what seems like a lost cause, even if the enemy is seemingly dancing on your grave, let me encourage you tonight. Let me encourage you to strengthen yourself and your resolve, and to build up your faith, and to do what Esther and Mordecai and the Jews did here. While the enemy's partying, no, here's what you do. Go to your prayer closet. Pray. Fast. Seek God and see if God won't come through for you in the end. And even while the enemy is partying, even while the enemy is celebrating his supposed victory, God's going to come through and win the battle for you. Haman expected honor, but Mordecai received that honor, and Haman is instead humiliated. We see that when Haman has to be the one to carry that horse that Mordecai is riding, he has to carry that through the city. And then in this second victory, or this second banquet, he is humiliated even more when he's dragged out by the servants and he's hanged on the very gallows he built for Mordecai. What's interesting here, and this leads us into next week, the final week. It's a great triumph for Mordecai. The death of his enemy. Haman is hanged on the gallows meant for him. But let's remember, the story is not finished. The decree that Haman put into place with the king's approval to, at the end of the month, in the 11th month of the year, I believe it was 11th or 12th month at the end of the year, all the Jews are going to be killed and all of their possessions taken from them. Of course, they'd be killed anyway, but all of their possessions taken, with part of that entering into the treasury of the king. That's still intact. And there was a rule from the Medes and the Persians that maybe has already been discussed, and it's going to be discussed next week. The king can't rescind that. That's in stone. And so next week we're going to see that this death of Haman is just a momentary victory. It is not the end of the story. And it is certainly not the end of the danger for Esther, Mordecai, their families, and certainly all the Jews within the kingdom of the Persians. Final point tonight. I think it's been a little bit shorter tonight. That's probably a good thing. Just I want to offer you this final point and observation from back in the 8th verse of our reading. Go back to verse 8. I've been reading from the New King James. I want to read to you verse 8, the first half of verse 8 from the NIV. Just as the king returned from the palace garden, just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch, and here's how the NIV translates those words, where Esther was reclining. Esther was sitting down. Wouldn't you think that with all the drama and the commotion of the last hour, wouldn't you think with all that had happened with the king leaving in anger, with Haman just losing all sense of decorum, begging for his life, I know when those types of things happen, and if I'm in the presence of this type of drama, I'm standing up. You can't stay seated. It's like I got to be standing up. First of all, just the emotional energy and the blood pressure rising. You break out in a sweat. Your breathing increases. You can't sit down. I know for me, in times of intensity like this, I mean, I got to leave the room, as the king did. I got to walk around. The nervous energy is such, it has to come out of you in some way. So maybe it comes out in anger, maybe it comes out just in fear, or your body responds. I got to go. I got to go use the bathroom. I got to do whatever. You got to do something. There's got to be a release of all of this pressure and energy. But what's Esther doing? The girl's sitting down. She's calm. She's resolved. I'd say she's even confident. When do we sit down? We sit down when the issue's been resolved. We sit down when the work is over. I know, and I use this analogy a lot in teaching and preaching. It bears repeating. When we're at the house and we're working and we're cleaning up, or if we're outside in the yard or whatever, my people love to just sit down. Stand up. What are you doing? Well, Daddy, I don't know what to do. Look busy. Or just stand there and wait for me to tell you what to do. If we're in the middle of working and doing things and you don't know what to do, that's not a sign that you get to go sit down and relax. Just at least stand there. At least stand there and give the appearance of being ready and being ready to accomplish something. What does she do? The girl sits down. I'm not criticizing her. I'm praising her. She sits down because her work is done. Esther's job here is finished. she's going to rely on God to take care of the rest. She's done what God told her to do. She fasted, she prayed, she had sleepless nights, she had uncertainty, she maybe even had some fear. She had to come clean with her husband, the king, of who she was. And this is years after she became queen. And but it's now up to God to do his part. And so Esther's like, I'm done. I'm finished. Hey, you gonna finish eating that? She's reclining at the dinner table and is like, it's up to God. It's up to God now. It's in God's hands. We should have that same confidence, that same resolution, that same calmness, where when it's up to God and we're relying on God to work, I'm sitting down. I've done what I can do. I've worked as hard as I can work. I've done what God has told me to do. That's really the point. I've done what God has told me to do. I've prayed. I've fasted. It's in his hands. The doctor's report may be negative. Pray. Do all that you can do. Go see the specialist. Get the second opinions. But in the final analysis, it's in God's hands. How about you have a seat? You got a family problem. There's issues in your home. You've prayed. You've fasted. You've sought God for the solution. You've done all that you can do. You've forgiven all that you can forgive. You've left the door open for resolution, for the return, for there to be restitution in relationship. You've done all that you can do. It's time to sit down. It's time to allow the Lord to do what he can do. Not just allow him, but to rely on him and to expect God to do what only God can do. You've got a financial problem. You're working as hard as you can. You're bringing in second jobs. You're looking for a new job. You're going to school. You're educating yourself. You're doing all that you can do. You've pinched every penny. You've cut off your phones. You're eating rice and beans, as Dave Ramsey talks about doing. You're doing all that you can do. Look, sit down. You've done what God told you to do. Relax. Rest. Jesus said, come to me, all ye who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For some of us tonight, we need to be Esther. We've lived in fear. We've hidden who we were. We're uncertain of the future. But while we are fasting and praying, and while we're uncertain of what's going on in our lives, there's I was going to say hidden God, only because he's hidden in this story of Esther. But there is the hand of God, the providence of God who's working and moving. And while you are praying and fasting and having your sleepless nights, he's over there in the king's palace, ensuring that the king is having a sleepless night. And he is working, and he is moving, and he is doing what only God can do. Let this be an encouragement to you tonight. When you've done, Paul says, having done all, he says there in Ephesians 6, and having done all, to stand. And what he means there when he says stand is just to stand firm. I think it even says stand firm. It means to be still. The psalmist says, be still and know that I am God. Moses at the Red Sea told the people of Israel to stand firm, again, to be still. So whether your physical posture is one, as Moses and the people of God's was, in standing, whether your physical posture is one of Esther's here, where she's literally reclining and sitting down, whatever the case may be, God is saying, I'm going to give you rest. God is saying, be still. Be still and know that I'm God. You've done all you can do. Stand, relax, rest, have confidence in me, and